This video I want to talk about why I think Joe Biden and his progressive puppeteers will not be able to handle the mullahs in Iran, in other words, the people who control the regime in Iran, if he somehow wins the election in November. Now, there are myriad reasons I could give to explain why I think that's true. But what I want to do in this video is just use one anecdote, a personal anecdote that I think gets into the problems of the progressive mindset, especially when it comes to dealing with the mullahs and dealing with Iran. But it's more widespread than that, but I'll talk about that later in the video. I don't remember the exact year, but it was George Bush was president. It was probably some point in Bush's second term. And the history department where I worked at East Carolina University was in the process of actually filling a position for somebody to teach Middle East history. We had people who did the Middle East tangentially. We had an Africanist who did stuff in the Middle East. I was an Americanist and I did stuff on the US and the Middle East. But we didn't actually have an actual Middle East historian, somebody whose scholarship was rooted in Arabic or Turkish or Ottoman Turkish or Farsi, Iranian, Persian. So we wanted to hire somebody like that. And basically we had three candidates. So one of them I thought was not very good at all. The other two were good. And we ultimately hired the second person, a woman who turned out to be very good. But my favorite candidate was a more senior guy. He had more teaching experience. He had published more. And he was an Iranian. He was from Iran. And I favored him for a variety of reasons. There are all kinds of different problems in the Middle East. But from my point of view, the two biggest ones were terrorism and Iran. In many ways, to me, those two were, in a sense, linked. So I favored the guy whose focus would be on Iran as opposed to the focus that would be more on the Arab world and the Palestinian, Arab, Israeli problem and all that stuff. So that was where I was. And he, to me, was the most impressive of the candidates. Now, I won't go into all the details of how we select personnel when we hire faculty, but I was the department chair and I was involved in all the hiring that went on. In some ways, I have to make the final decision within certain limitations. And because I was involved, I would have a one-on-one interview with all the people that we were thinking about hiring. And when they would have dinners with the personnel committee, I would go to those too, all for me to observe and listen and to try to gauge faculty interest and the personality of the person and how likely they were to be a good fit. So I had my one-on-one interview with the guy, and he was very interesting. He knew about one of the books I had published. It's called Guardians of the Gulf. I think it came out in '92. And it was about the U.S. relationship with the Persian Gulf. And of course, Iran figured prominently in that book, as did the Arab Gulf states. So he was somewhat familiar with that. And because of that, I think he was pretty much at ease talking to me as two scholars who had both worked on some of the same issues. Now, I said he was Iranian. He wasn't just an Iranian American, although he was then, but he had come from Iran. And he was schooled in Iran and some European places too. And he was asking me all kinds of questions. How did I get involved in the Middle East? Who did I learn from? Who did I study under? All that kind of stuff. So I started asking him questions too. And I knew he was, about the age of people who might have gotten involved in the revolution in 1979. I had had a roommate, a colleague in graduate school who was a fellow grad student who was Iranian. He was anti-Shah. He was Tudeh party, communist. And when the revolution broke out, he caught the first Pan Am flight back to Tehran, and he promptly disappeared. And we didn't see him for a few years. And since then, I haven't talked to him since he got out, but he's in the US now and he's okay. I don't know all the details of what happened to him or where he stands now in the Iranian regime or anything like that. I certainly don't mean to speak for him. But I must have mentioned that. So the guy started talking about his experience, and he was from Iran. And he had also been in favor of overthrowing the Shah. He had supported the revolution. He didn't like Khomeini, though. And when things started to go wrong and the mullahs started getting more and more powerful, he ended up in prison. And he was tortured. He was threatened with execution. But ultimately, after several years, he was released. And he had managed to sneak out of Iran and escape and make his way via a bunch of other countries, ultimately getting to the United States. And here he was. So he's a very interesting guy. Needless to say, while he's Iranian and he loves Iran and he loves the Iranian people, he was no person who was in love with the current regime in Tehran, the Mullahs, I would call them. Anyway, the interview was over. He left, but I knew I'd see him again because that night there was a dinner with the search committee, and I, of course, as chair, was invited to that. I actually ended up paying for it out of department funds, of course. So I went, and we were having this dinner, and it was, the usual chit chat you have at these dinners. Sometimes the faculty aren't very focused on what they're doing, so they were talking about all kinds of things. Some of them weren't engaging with him, some of them were, and he was sitting there. But there was a colleague, he was sitting across from me, this Iranian candidate, and somewhat I think it was to my right, was one of my colleagues who was sitting. And this guy, he was like one of the most bleeding heart liberals there was, the ultimate progressive. And he jumps into this conversation, and he starts off by saying something to the effect that, I know you're an Iranian, I know you must love your country, and it must be really grating for you to be in a country like the United States, where people are so against Iran. And I'd just like to, for my part, to apologize for the anti-Iranian sentiments in this country. I think it's just terrible. Now I'm sitting here listening to this, and here's this colleague of mine making assumptions about this Iranian because he loves Iran, which I'm sure he did. Most Iranians do that I've ever encountered or connected with on social media. They love their country. They love their fellow Iranians. They may not like the regime. And here was a guy who had been imprisoned by the regime, tortured by the regime, threatened with execution by the regime. And here's my progressive colleague apologizing for the United States because some people don't like the Iranian regime. So the guy's across from me, and I'm watching him, and his eyes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. He can't believe what he's hearing. That this, not only what this guy's saying, but what this guy's assuming about him and how he thinks without even knowing anything about him. So his mouth started to move. He looks at me, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is going to be bad. So I think I changed the subject. I don't know how I did it, but I changed the subject, and we moved on. And I thought, this isn't going well. Anyway, the guy left the next day. He had a breakfast and another exit interview with an assistant dean or associate dean or somebody, and then off he flew. And I'm just waiting and waiting and waiting. And sure enough, the following day, I get a phone call. Later on, I'll get an official email from him. And he withdrew from the search. And, it was clear why he withdrew from the search. He didn't want to come to our department, with I think I don't know if he used the word moron, but it was something like that. He didn't want to work with people who made assumptions about how he was approaching things. And that was the end of his candidacy. So we fell back on the next candidate, who a lot of people liked anyway, and I did too. And we hired her, and ultimately she did very well. So the search was a success. So what had happened? You had a progressive American who approached the U.S.-Iranian relationship with a certain perspective, had a certain perspective about the Iranian regime, which seemed to be that everybody in Iran must love that regime. And then, because the candidate was Iranian, assumed that Iranian shared the same view about the mullahs and the regime as did the American progressive, who had never stepped foot in Iran, despite the fact that he knew nothing about this individual Iranian, who, if you looked at his age and things, you would have known that for some reason he must have left the country. If he loved the Iranian regime that much, why was he here? Every time I meet an Iranian or I have connection with Iranian, I don't make the assumption that they hate the mullahs. Many of them don't, but some do. Some just don't give a crap anymore. They've left the country and they're here. But I would never make the assumption if I met an Iranian, especially one who's roughly my age, to now in the 60s or a little older, I would never make the assumption, especially if they're here, that they love the regime. Because if they loved the regime, they probably wouldn't be here. But here you have this progressive projecting his views onto this Iranian and apologizing for U.S. policy to a man who probably was hoping the U.S. maybe would help in overthrowing the regime. I mean, it makes no sense. But that's how, the progressive mind works. You make assumptions, you come up with conclusions about how you think, and then you assume that everybody must share those assumptions, especially the people whom you want to help. I mean, this is part of the entire problem that progressives have dealing with things. I mean, this is what progressives do all the time. I mean, I've recently seen a couple of videos where you have, in one case, it's a white woman, one of these protests. I don't want to attach her to a specific group. I don't know, Antifa, BLM, who she belonged to. And there's another one with a white male, looks like a soy boy with a man bun, dressed like your typical, progressive hipster. And they're out there engaged in conversations with black cops. And here you have these two white progressives explaining to the black policeman what it means to be a black man in this country. I mean, I would never, I might have ideas of how I think blacks should, move politically to try to get ahead in the country or improve some of the problems that they face. But I would never make the assumption that, the 50 million African-American people in this country all share my view, or even that they all think alike. I mean, I worked with black people from the time I was 16. They all have different views. Some lean a little left, some lean a little right, some lean far left, some lean far right. Some have mixed views. They're left on this and right on that. I mean, if there's 50 million African Americans in this country, there's 50 million political views. But progressives seem to think they understand how all 50 million of them think. And of course, if they don't think that way, there must be something wrong with them. And they project their own beliefs about the African American situation onto African Americans and assume that they all think just like them. And they do the same with Hispanics, and they do the same with women, and they do the same with every other group. As Presley said, black people should speak like black people, brown people should speak like brown people, etc., etc., etc. And it's just bullshit. And that's what my colleague was doing with this Iranian who had fled the regime for his life. He had his worldview, his progressive worldview about the nature of the relationship between the U.S. and Iran. That must be right. This guy is an Iranian, ergo, he must share my worldview. So I'll make an assumption without knowing anything about him that he does and approach him in that manner. One could argue that that's, racist. It's certainly stupid to make assumptions like that. My partner is East Asian. I meet a lot of East Asians, and a lot of our friends are from South Asia. I don't, if I meet somebody who's Indian, I don't immediately assume that they hate Modi, because people in the left in this country do. I don't make assumptions about, how they would vote if they were back in India. They have different views. There are a billion Indians. There's probably a billion different views about, what they do, how they think. And, you really need to avoid assumptions like that. Anyway, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button so you know when I post new videos. And until the next time, I am out of here.